Thank you for joining me today for our final training video called Where Do We Go From Here? I'm Dr. Carrie Finley, and I'm a senior research scientist at the Center for Health and Safety Culture at Montana State University. Before working for the Center for Health and Safety Culture, I managed a behavioral health clinic serving individuals with mental health and substance use disorders. During that time, I experienced firsthand the impact stigma has on addressing these issues. This video, called Where Do We Go From Here, is the final video in a series of 6 training videos. Other videos in this series include What is Stigma? How does stigma impact us? Where does stigma come from? How can I make a difference Part 1? How can I make a difference Part 2? Each video in the series is 7 to 10 minutes long, and we encourage you to review and discuss all 6 videos. In today's training video, we're going to recap where we've been in this training series and then focus on where do we go from here. We started this video series focused on defining stigma as a strong feeling of disapproval that most people in society have about something. We talked about how stigma can generate negative attitudes about people with a condition, and these negative attitudes can lead to discriminatory practices. We further defined stigma as a social process. That is, something that groups of people, often in power, create towards other people. Stigma is complex, and it can appear in several different ways. We explored 4 kinds of stigma: public stigma, self-stigma, courtesy stigma, and structural stigma. And we talked about the negative consequences that stigma can result in, like barriers to new relationships, lowered self-esteem, feelings of shame and guilt, and a reduced sense of hope, just to name a few. We also started to dive into exploring why certain conditions get stigmatized and others don't, by looking at a variety of different factors that researchers have identified as contributors to stigma. The 6 contributing factors we talked about included concealability, coarse, disruptiveness, aesthetic qualities, origin, and peril. We talked about 2 theories that help us to get closer to understanding the phenomena of stigma and help us get closer to understanding why some conditions get stigmatized and others don't. We talked specifically about labeling theory and attribution theory. And while these aren't the only theories, I think these 2 are important in our understanding about what we can do to make a difference and reduce stigma. We talked about 4 ways to reduce stigma. First, we talked about being cautious of the language we're using to describe people. We talked about using first-person language and to avoid describing people as their condition. Next, we talked about education and how learning factual information and countering inaccuracies is an important component to reduce stigma. Stigmas are slow to change, even when evidence no longer supports their underlying assumptions. Educating ourselves is essential. Third, we discussed the importance of experiences and how experiences can change our beliefs. We could put ourselves in a position to have intentional experiences. The research suggests that people without stigmatized conditions often have very little meaningful contact with those that do have these conditions. Lack of contact fosters fear and distrust. Experiences can overcome this divide. And finally, reviewing the practices and policies that we have in our organizations can reduce stigma. Asking the people that we serve how the practices and policies we have in place might impede their access to services, their compliance with treatment, and their overall well-being. That can be insightful. Often we get so immersed in the work that we're doing, we don't ask those that we're serving how certain practices or policies would impact them. The complexities of stigma may leave some to conclude that stigma is an unsolvable problem. But to this conclusion, I would say no. We can do something about stigma. We can reduce stigma. Stigma is a social process, and social processes can change. Through intentional action, we can move our society in a positive direction towards increased connection among people and increased acceptance. Research study after research study has shown the negative consequences associated with stigma. We currently live in a world where some conditions are stigmatized and others aren't, and because of this, people might not get the help they need or stick with the treatment they've been prescribed. Stigma is complex, manifesting itself in different ways at the societal level, at the personal level, and in the structures that we've built. Stigma decreases quality of life. It negatively impacts a person's sense of hope, self-esteem, and self-efficacy. So I challenge each of you to a call of action. What actions are possible, either personally or professionally, to move us towards reducing stigma? Maybe you found ways personally or professionally that you can change the language you're using. Maybe you've revealed some assumptions that you've been making that need to be challenged, or an area that requires further education and understanding for yourself. Maybe you have an opportunity to seek an intentional experience. Or you've decided to review some of the practices and policies you currently have in place. I invite you to pause the video here and to fill out your plan to reduce stigma. You can find this on your handout for this training video. If you're watching this video with others, I encourage you to engage in a discussion about these reflective questions as you develop your personal action plan. What if our actions could reduce the negative consequences associated with stigma? I venture to guess and to hope that we would be in a world then without stigma that would be more tolerant, more proactive, and would alleviate the suffering of many people. Each of us has a role. Each of us has a stake in this outcome. So, do you remember how we opened this training video series? In video 1, I asked you if you knew someone who was left-handed. And we talked about how left-handed people were marked as potentially dangerous and more likely to have cognitive or learning issues. That was expert thinking in 1946. Our thoughts have changed in the past 70 years or so. So stigmas can change, but it will only change if we take steps to make it change. I hope you've enjoyed this stigma training video series. Please keep the conversation going. Feel free to share the training videos with others, and please connect with us on social media. Thank you for joining me.